By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. It is Monday, the 19th day of December, 2022, and it is time for the reading of our devotional thought for today. Clive Walsh here, inviting you to join me for the next 5 minutes as we learn what the Spirit of God might have to say to us through this devotional thought, which is entitled Future Glory. And the verse for today, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 22, which reads, By faith Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. That's the book of Hebrews chapter 11, verse 22. Alistair Begg writes, The book of Genesis ends with Joseph's death, but that was nowhere near the end of the story. It marks just the beginning of the story of God's provision and deliverance, which carries on throughout the rest of the Bible and into our own lives today. Joseph took great care over what was to happen to his remains after death, not because of some morbid interest, but to offer as a symbol of God's provision in the past and the promise of a future deliverance. Joseph's bones pointed future generations of Israel forward to promises that were then yet to be fulfilled. Despite all the extraordinary trials and experiences that defined Joseph's life, being betrayed by his brothers, wrongfully accused by Potiphar's wife, and favored by Pharaoh, positioned within the Egyptian royal court, reunited with his family, and so on. The author of Hebrews chose to highlight none of those things, but rather Joseph's faith for what was to come. Why? Because it was so phenomenally significant. Joseph did not want his family to settle their roots deeply in Egypt. He knew that the promised land was coming. Instead of an elaborate funeral, then, he only asked for his body to be embalmed, placed in a coffin, and left in Egypt. Genesis chapter 50, verses 22 through 26. Why? He didn't want his body to be buried. He wanted his body to be ready to be moved when it was time to travel to the Promised Land. He recognized that the coffin itself would be a memorial of the fact the hope of the Promised Land was as certain as any promise God had ever made. When difficult days would come for the future generations of his growing refugee family, as he surely imagined they would, he wanted them to be able to look to the promise. They could look at his coffin standing at the ready and say, Joseph was sure we would leave. If he hadn't been sure, he wouldn't have had us carting his bones around like this. Today, you do not have Joseph's coffin full of bones to look to. Instead, you have an empty tomb to remind you of God's provision in the past and your promised hope for the future. Christ is our help in all ages, our hope for years to come. He is our eternal home. Because of him, you can live through difficult days and die on your final day, secure in your hope of heaven, our great promised land. And that concludes the reading of our devotional thought for today, Future Glory. And it's definitely something we are looking forward to, eagerly anticipating. And if you're not, perhaps you're not ready, and today is the day you need to get ready, because this day will surely come. If you find yourself moved by circumstances, stick to the Word of God. He is faithful. Well, Clive Walsh here, trusting that this devotional thought, as well as all of the devotional thoughts, are a blessing to you. And if they are, drop us a line at lighthousesanpedro@gmail.com. That's lighthousesanpedro@gmail.com. And may God richly bless you. And for those of you reading through the scriptures in a year, Nehemiah chapter 1 through 3, and Luke chapter 19, verses 1 through 27. Clive Walsh here. May the Lord richly bless you.